I remember after a breakup a long time ago, a relationship that I had, it was a longer relationship. It ended where I was talking to a friend who knew both of us well. And I said to him, everything seems perfect on the surface with this person. You know, we seem to be compatible in every imaginable way I can think of. But I said to my friend, I won't, yeah, I almost feel like mentioning his name, but then it could potentially lead somebody to figuring out who exactly I'm talking about. But I said to the friend, but what I'm missing is a Vulcan mind meld, is what I said. The Vulcans in the Star Trek series, I can't remember exactly how it works now. Like they touch their fingers to
Right. They've
their
put their
temples.
fingers something. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and they really what you're describing, and maybe what Star Trek, I think the writers have been amazing even since the 60s with the original series of taking intuitive or genuinely scientific concepts and using a sci-fi way of bringing that to life so it's especially easy to understand. And this sounds like the kind of thing, this idea of neural entrainment. I'm pretty confident that term didn't exist in the 60s. Maybe it did.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it definitely did not. But you're right. A mind meld. I mean, what's interesting is that, like, okay, so the Vulcans can do the mind meld just by touching each other, right? But what's interesting is that we can actually all mind meld with anyone. It's just a series of skills. And the reason why it's a series of skills is because a brain has evolved to allow that mind meld. Now, I don't know if it's quite the mind meld that the Vulcans can achieve, but it is a mind meld that feels very meaningful. And this is why those three kinds of conversations are so important, is because when I'm having a practical conversation, I'm using my prefrontal cortex. And if you're having an emotional conversation, you're using your amygdala. And it's very hard for us to speak to it's very hard for us to our brains to start looking similar if we're using different parts of our brains. So that's why matching you, even if we don't stay on that type of conversation for very long, matching you allows us to become aligned and synchronized. And once we're synchronized, it's very easy to maintain that synchronization.
Wow. Just out of curiosity, I come from a neuroscience background, so this makes a huge amount of intuitive sense to me that amygdala would be activated during feeling, and that's a brain structure that's very old. So reptiles have it, for example, and it's right in the center of your brain. Um, Critical, any kind of emotional experience that you have can activate that. Your cortex of your brain, that's the latest part of the brain to evolve. It's the outermost. And it's what humans have a lot more of relative to their body mass and is what allows us to have more intellectual capabilities than an elephant. Because an elephant has way more cortex than us. But the ratio that we have to our body mass is very large. And in particular, relative to, say, chimpanzees, bonobos, which are our closest living relatives, humans have a lot of prefrontal cortex, which you mentioned there. And so that prefrontal cortex is what allows humans to be uniquely capable of planning and of maintaining a thought and working with symbols and language. So it's unsurprising to me to hear that that prefrontal cortex is critical to the practical decision-making conversation. That's the what you call "what's this really about" conversation, and it makes perfect sense to me that the amygdala is critical in that emotional "how do we feel" conversation. For the third category, the exploratory social conversation, that "who are we" conversation, is there a neural correlate of that you're aware
There
of?
is. It's the medial frontal network. So it's more distributed and it's essentially at the periphery of our skull. Um, and what's interesting is that without us realizing it, about 70% of our conversations are social conversations. So anytime you're talking about another person, you're talking about how people interact with each other, you're talking about how you see yourself or how society sees yourself, we're actually tapping into that social conversation, the medial frontal network. And what's happening there is the reason why it's so distributed is because it can pluck from different parts of the brain very, very effectively. So think about office gossip, which is like the um, prototypical social conversation. Office gossip is incredibly important to workplaces, and study after study shows this because it's a way of us establishing social norms without having to describe them explicitly. So when we go and we say, "Oh, at the office party, did you see how drunk Judy got? Like that was she was out of control." What I'm really saying is in this workplace, it's okay to go to the party. It's not okay to get so drunk that that you
Mm.
embarrass yourself. But I couldn't write that down in an employee handbook, and it's kind of awkward to say that. So what I do is I teach that lesson by engaging in a social conversation. Now, when that's happening within our brain, not only are we using the prefrontal cortex, right? We're dipping into the prefrontal cortex for basically seeing cause and effect, but we're also dipping into a shared sense of shame that comes from the amygdala. So, excuse me. So there is a band of our neural processing that tends to sort of loop around the whole brain, and it gives it access to activating different parts of the brain and really having very complex conversations as a result. Social interactions are complex things. And so it usually draws on a distributed networks within our brain.